Okay, let me explain a little bit about the FinTR first, and then I will leave the stage to you guys. First of all, I would like to say welcome to all of the attendees and our valuable speakers. FinTR, as you know, FinTR is the only fintech association in Turkey, and our aim is to build sustainable fintech ecosystem within the country and connecting this community with the globe. What I mean by sustainable is to create the right communication channels among parties like banks, insurance companies, startups, scale-ups, capital market players, and e-commerce platforms, big techs, you know, the community players already. And Fintech Association Turkey will enable these parties towards further collaboration and interaction. And FinTR will also provide insights to the regulatory bodies with the market's needs by research reports and white papers. Today, we are hosting a global player in our webinar for a very specific need of both fintech companies and traditional financial players. We are all digitalizing our lives with an exponential speed because of the pandemic conditions. We can say much more than expected. So that fraud detection became much more important for all of us, even a lifesaver, we can say. Am I right, Ben? And to prevent the disaster before it happens, we need to be proactive more than ever. Our speakers will present us the OneSpan technology, which is based on machine learning and risk analytics in preventing fraud and cyber risks today. Let me stop here and introduce our speakers before leaving the stage to them. Greg Hancell, Senior Manager, Fraud Consulting and in Fraud Consulting from OneSpan, and Ben Balthazar, Senior Fraud Consultant in OneSpan again. And one additional note before they carry on, let me openly invite again those who are involved this way or other in the Turkish fintech industry to get to know more about FinTR. It's in its activities and projects like this webinar. This is an open community that embraces all participants. Our membership is growing, but we expect all other players to take part in this. Okay, I stop now. And Greg?
Thank you, Demet. Welcome everyone today. Hopefully we can have some fun with you and take you through some of the attacks that we see in digital banking. We'll go into some specific examples around that. We'll talk a little bit around, I guess, what's happened in the past year, specifically how the pandemic has accelerated the shift towards digital banking, and then we'll summarize with how you can identify some of these attacks and how you can prevent some of those as well, with a touch into some machine learning attributes as well from a business angle. Demet, thank you for the introduction. I'll quickly skip through this bit here, but indeed we have Ben Balthazar. Ben will be going into the specific details of some of these attacks to digital banks. Ben has many years experience working in the finance industry and in the security industry as an expert, and fully understands the different types of attacks. Specifically, he's written some great articles around the use of Morena and Necro browser and how that can bypass two-factor authentication. So I look forward to seeing that from Ben. Myself, I'm a bit of an all-rounder. Started out in insurance fraud risk, shifted across towards a card present, card not present risk, and then shifted into digital banking risk. I welcome you all today, and I appreciate you giving your time, and we hope to have some fun. So maybe it's worth our while just reflecting on how we got here to where we are in 21. So what we're seeing is an increase in the adoption of remote banking, specifically towards mobile banking. For example, in the United States, there are some banks that are reporting an 80% increase in terms of the movement towards mobile banking. So it's not just that customers are going to digital banking, it's that they're specifically going to mobile banking. And that's likely because of the convenience of having a mobile phone with them. If you're sat on the sofa, it's useful to be able to do your banking there, for example. We're seeing a shift in habits, and we expect that shift in habits to persist. Now customers are more than ever starting to online on board. They're starting to open up bank accounts digitally, and they're somewhat expecting that as well. More customers or more employees are working remotely, and there are more employees that are expecting to stay remote and to maybe even move outside of the city. There's been a big shift towards out of city living in 2020, and the demand is increasing. So we can expect that remote work and remote digital services will increase and will continue into the future. And mobile banking specifically is a very lucrative target for attackers. They have been in this space for quite some time, specifically in web banking attacks, and they have a great battery of tool sets, unfortunately for us, but fortunately for them, that they can use to attack the banks. And they are very experienced in doing so. With the emergence of crime as a service as well, and this is something we'll touch on briefly, and some of the things available there, it's meaning that the barriers to entry for the attackers is also reducing as well. And if we look at 2020 in summary, we know it's a record year in terms of identity theft. So in terms of the number of records lost year on year, you'll see as I build up this slide, going from 2013 with there at 1.1 billion through to 2016, 2019, and then on to 2020, we had 37 billion records lost in 2020. So that's a record loss of records. And when I ran some numbers around this, I focused on one of the attacks by Shiny Hunters, which had managed to compromise roughly 130 million records. And of those, there were roughly 1.1 distinct identifiable users or people. So if we apply that number, what we can roughly say is around 10% of the online digital online users was compromised in 2020 alone. So it's really frightening, that side of things. And if we come into some further numbers, we can see 37 billion records compromised, of which there were roughly 3,932 publicly reported breach events. That number is always a little lower at the end of the year, as companies are still disclosing some of those breaches. So what that means is that actually the loss of records should be taken as a given, in fact, and that somebody's identity is most likely compromised. So what that means is that actually financial institutions need to consider that the entity points that they use, such as the name, the date of birth, the address, a telephone number, an email address, has likely been compromised and is likely known by an attack group. So if these entity points are used as part of a registration process or an onboarding process, then that can really enable an attacker to intervene and to perform an identity theft, and therefore an account takeover, for example, or to create a new synthetic identity or a new product with the bank. So that really matters. And if we look at some of the statistics around the number of active users, so we have 4.6 billion active internet users. That's from Statista.com. And incidentally, the information I got around the identity breaches was from a Risk-Based Security 2020 year-end data breach quick view report. So 59% of the global population is online. So 91% of those are mobile internet users. What that means is that people are more than ever using their mobile to interact with the internet. And that also means that there's likely going to be that shift into internet banking towards mobile banking as well. So estimated 10% of the world population was compromised in 2020. And just recently, in fact, I was made aware of a breach of 220 million Brazilian records in January 2021. Literally the population of Brazil, with names, addresses, dates of birth, as well as I understand social profiling, contact, work employment history, and all of this information as well. So that really, we really need to accept that if you believe that your data is your own, then that's probably not the best way to approach that. What we should perhaps think of is that actually it's more likely than not that a significant customer set will have had their data breached. So we need to think about that. And also, if we think about what does that mean from a banking perspective, well, we should not be looking to use static credentials for authentication. So if banks are using a username and a password or a static password for a registration or for an activation of an authentication device, or for a login or transactional beneficiary creation, or in corporate banking, for example, the creation of a user or the escalation of privileges or things of this nature, well, that's not great, because what we know is that, in last year, maybe 10% of those credentials and their identity was taken. So that means that ultimately that's an easy access for an attacker to get through. And also that what we also saw was an attack that was identified late last year in the US specifically, and that is that there was a group of one of the advanced persistent threat groups, one of the organized crime groups, was actually very expertly able to simulate mobile banking devices and to simulate the payload that is created. So the information that is sent through to the bank and able to interact with the bank's APIs in such a way that they were able to overcome the security that was put in place, that was specifically making use of one-time passwords via SMS or the use of one-time passwords via a mobile banking application. So this attack group was able to onboard many new devices and also imitate current devices for current customers to overcome the security that was in place, specifically looking at the device. So it doesn't just mean that the identity of a person, a human, is potentially vulnerable, but also their digital identity. And why that matters is if that's the thing that you use as a bank to provide security to a login, let's say. So if you're looking at, is this a new device or have I seen that device before? Well, actually what we're seeing now is that organized crime groups can overcome that and can actually simulate that very well. So we can't just use that on its own. So these emulators exist to reproduce a user's digital fingerprint at scale. And also crime as a service does generate large profit for these organized crime groups. And it's an area of specific focus for them, where many of these organized crime groups have diversified their product range more towards the digital banking realm, because there is a lower risk to them in terms of if they are caught, and a higher return on their investment as well. And of course, mobile banking users are increasing. And then if we look at broadly at phishing and man in the middle versus one factor or single factor authentication. So if it is a simple authentication where there is, let's say, a username and credentials, or potentially the use of a recovery email address or recovery credentials, well, in this scenario, what we can expect is if there is a malicious actor, then that information is probably under their control. And the reason why I bring up the recovery email address and the recovery credentials is what we are seeing is that as banks move to applying a second factor authentication, which is, for example, sending a one-time code via SMS or generating a one-time code in their application, then what attackers are actually doing is moving towards a process abuse, and that is figuring out how they can overcome the process this is put in place by the bank. So if you think about your weaknesses as a bank, then it is not just your login or your transaction signature that you need to be concerned about. It's also a recovery process. And what we've seen with quite a few banks is that they will default back to a user's email address as a recovery process. And typically a user's email account will not have a second factor authentication applied, requiring a one-time code. So what attackers will do is simply overcome the email address and then also be able to do a full recovery from internet banking from there, and also likely intercept anything else. Also, if that's used as a channel to communicate with a user as a bank, well, the attacker, if they overcome the security of the email, well, then they will be able to see who the user banks with and go through that full recovery process as well. So that's pretty important to note, that it's not just the underlying technology that you need to consider, but also the process that your users go through and the potential vulnerabilities there. And if we look at phishing or man in the middle versus a second factor authentication, where a one-time code is generated, well, we have the same approach here. Let's say with somebody uses a username and plus a one-time code. Well, they are more secure inherently, and we know from Google, for example, where they applied a strong authentication to their workers, that they were able to reduce the number of significant attacks, I think, by around 99%. So it is a great way of securing your users. However, there is still it is still open to specific types of attacks. So there is a reduced attack success. However, it does depend on where you apply strong customer authentication. So where you apply that request for that one-time code. If that is not on a recovery process, if that is not on an activation process, or on the transfer of a device, that device might be an authenticating device, well, then that can obviously cause problems, because the attacker can overcome that part of the process. Also, with reconnaissance, that can increase the attack success. What we're seeing specifically in Europe on the banks that shifted to strong customer authentication quite some time back as a requirement from the Payment Services Directive 2 from the 14th of September 2019. Well, what's actually happening now is there is an increase in the types of attacks, such as an invoice fraud attack or a scam fraud attack, and specifically in social engineering. So now users are being vished, where the attacker will call the user, pretend to be from the bank, tell them that they are going to send them a one-time code, and that they need to read that out to them in order to authenticate that, you know, you are the bank. So in doing so, they are then disclosing the one-time code that is then used to log in or potentially sign a transaction. So it really depends where you apply this second factor authentication and just how much damage can be done by an attacker before they hit that requirement. So that's important as well. And specifically, Morena and Necro browser can actually overcome that by a reverse proxy and taking that session, stealing that session from the victim as well, which Ben will go through in detail in just a moment. So that's some really important points, I believe, on that. Ben, so I think it's over to you now. So I'll give you control.
So before we go to the more complex attacks, of course, we're first going to talk about, let's say, the most common ones. Unfortunately, despite how much it's mentioned, SMS one-time passwords are still so common, especially if we look at retail banking. In many parts of the world, SMS is just still very widely used. It's easy to explain. It's a very easy to adopt technology, so it's really easy to adopt SMS to FA. It's, let's say, easy for a user because all they need is a mobile number. They don't need to install an application or anything. So it's easy to deploy, easy to adopt. Unfortunately, it suffers from many different problems. Whereas, typically, like I mentioned, an attacker will try to attack the processes rather than the technology, because the technology proves to be more difficult. With SMS, actually, the underlying channel or the underlying technology is already vulnerable by itself. So, some of the common problems around SMS is when these SMS one-time passwords are being deployed, typically they're deployed without context, which means, someone does a payment or they're logging into an application, they receive a text message with a one-time code on their phone. They have no idea what that one-time code is actually about to authorize. So of course, an attacker will take advantage of this and they will steal those one-time codes because the user has no idea what they're used for. So they can easily be grabbed to a phishing page, to a social engineering scam. They can call up the user and ask them to hand over the codes, which unfortunately is still very common as well. But other than that, we see other types of attacks which are specific to using SMS. For example, in the Middle East, we see that the SIM swap attack is very common, where rather than attacking the user, they'll actually go for the telco provider who's issuing the SIM cards, and they'll essentially abuse the process on that side, commit some kind of identity theft, sometimes bribery inside the organization. And then essentially they'll have the telco provider issue a new SIM card for the user's phone number to the attacker. And then the attacker now owns the phone number. So all the one-time codes that are sent by the bank are just going right to the attacker. And the user is completely unaware because actually their SIM card stops working when a new one is issued. So they're not even aware that it's happening until it's too late. And we see this happen quite often in regions where SMS is very widely adopted. Some other problems is, of course, that it's a one-directional channel. There is no way for the user to interact with that channel. So it's very prone to phishing, to social engineering. And essentially that one-time code is then typically input either in a mobile app or in a web page, where it again can be grabbed by an attacker, through different kinds of malware, where they grab those from the forums and then repurpose them, because essentially they're not linked to any specific actions. So if we look at the most common one, right, it's typically phishing. Phishing is still super effective, and it's sometimes much more advanced than people are aware of. Like, for example, they think phishing is, a poorly designed website full of spelling mistakes and things like that, served over HTTP without encryption. And in fact, we see most phishing pages have SSL certificates. They are running over HTTPS. So they typically tend to look pretty professional nowadays if it's a good phishing page. And there's different toolkits, or phish kits as they call them, that will help an attacker craft these very well crafted pages that can look similar or even identical to the original page. And on top of that, the attacker can then also add in real-time interaction, where they're alerted if a victim connects to the page, and they can actually automate the entire process if there's a multi-step process that the user needs to go through. And we see that with, for example, the one where the creator was allegedly arrested recently, which is called UAdmin, which was a very widely used phish kit that can do all of this. So if we look at phishing, the basic concept is typically the attacker will spread their phishing page through spam campaigns, typically emails or text messages or things like that. So a user is essentially tricked into going to a malicious page. They arrive on a malicious page where they are then essentially asked for credentials or information. So they're going to steal personal information, preferably usernames, passwords, email addresses, phone numbers, that they can then repurpose to access the bank. As part of the phish, if you're using SMS, they will just take the one-time password as well. Typically, they have a pretty long lifetime as well, because SMS is a pretty unreliable channel. So just as part of the phishing, they will grab the one-time passwords. Essentially, the attacker receives all the information the victim enters into the page, and they then happily use that at the bank and extract all the victim's funds using those stolen one-time passwords. So it's a pretty easy to set up attack, and technically not very complicated to execute, which is why it's so common. If we look at another example where essentially the attacker attacks two different channels at the same time. So here, again, victim goes onto a phishing page, but the phishing page also asks for the user's mobile number. And then, victim hands over the credentials to the phishing page, which goes to the attacker. Now they've also got the mobile number, so they craft an SMS message posing from being the bank, saying, oh, there's a new security update, for example, for the application that you need to install. So the victim then also downloads this malicious application onto their device. So now they've compromised the victim's credentials, and they've also compromised their mobile device. So now when the attacker goes to the bank, they use those stolen static credentials, and the bank issues an SMS one-time password. The malware will just take the SMS and immediately forward it to the attacker. So essentially, they have full control of that mobile device as well, which means they can do whatever they want. So then we move on to, let's say, a bit more advanced technology where we don't use the underlying insecure channel, but instead we then use hardware or software devices to generate those one-time codes. Now we see that while the technology itself is still pretty solid and pretty secure, the way it's typically applied can still have many, many ways of attacking it. For example, those codes essentially still need to be entered into a web page or into an app. So those codes can still be stolen, especially if dynamic linking is not applied, which is a form of transaction signing where the transaction details are a part of that one-time code generation process and validation process. Then you still have a big problem because those codes could be used for anything. A stolen code can authenticate any transaction, which is why dynamic linking is a very important factor of strong customer authentication. Of course, you can still apply social engineering. You can apply things like invoice fraud to make sure it's actually, the victim is actually doing the transfer for you, and they're just, doing a transfer to a wrong account number, for example. So essentially, you bypass the whole, having to overcome this authentication because the victim is doing it genuinely for you. You have other types of attacks, such as, mobile malware, which can grab the codes. You have overlay attacks on the mobile, which pop up an almost identical screen that will then grab codes. You can have man-in-the-browser attacks that grab it from your browser, or you can have reverse proxy, which I'll show you later, which is a pretty strong attack. Because if we move to an even more, technology secure approach where we have remote authentication with a secure channel, which is essentially the user doesn't need to manually enter any one-time codes. So, for example, they're sent a notification, the communication's encrypted, they validate that notification, and then a one-time code is automatically generated and sent back to the bank. Well, that's pretty difficult to attack, and you can't steal that code anymore because it's never entered. It's in a direct channel between the user's phone and the bank. Well, we see we can still apply social engineering, right? We can still have the victim execute our malicious actions for us and apply some kind of social pressure to do that. But there's an interesting one which we can also do, which is the reverse proxy. A reverse proxy is one of the reasons that I've had customers or prospects ask me about, if I just secure my login process, then am I not completely protected? Because if they can't log in and my login is super secure, well, then everything behind that is also secure. And as I'll show you here, that's not at all the case. So what we need in this case is we need a setup where the attacker sets up a malicious page. It's essentially a reverse proxy. So it's a page that they're hosting, which communicates directly with the original bank page. So whenever the user goes to this website, first of all, it can run HTTPS. So there's no things about the green padlock icon that will work. The only thing that will be different from the original page is actually it would be a different URL. Other than that, website's identical. Everything interacts directly with the banking page. So this reverse proxy essentially just sets up an intermediate, machine in between the customer and the bank's connection. So when the bank then, logs in, when the customer logs into the bank initiates the remote authentication procedure. So they send a push notification or they ask to scan an image or something similar, and then the victim executes that authentication, the bank approves the authentication and they enable the session. Now, at any point in time, what the attacker can do using Necro browser, which is another application they'll use in combination with the reverse proxy, is they can actually hand off the session to themselves. So they can take control of that banking session whenever they want. And they, of course, can kick the user off the session as well. So here, the user logs in completely legitimate. And at any point in time, the attacker can just go, oh, this is my session now. Thank you very much. I'll continue the session. You're done for today. And then they can just extract the funds from the bank. So, securing the login is definitely not everything. And this overcomes pretty much any type of authentication that you can imagine, because, there's essentially nothing else to protect the user here, unless you have some very advanced mechanisms to try and do proxy piercing and things like that. So if we look at how to protect our customers, well, we see we always resort to a layered approach in security, right? So same is true here. One of the most important components, as Greg mentioned, is having strong customer authentication, right? Like it's the basic countermeasure against the very, very easy attacks and phishing and credential stuffing and things like that. But on top of that, we want to make sure we apply dynamic linking, or we bring context into, what is that OTP or that one-time password actually going to do? That's got to be linked to a specific operation or a specific transaction. If it's universally usable, it's a big problem, and it's definitely going to be attacked. Now, on top of that, we typically also try to build secure communication channel, which means the attacker cannot sit in the middle and play around with the information we exchange with the victim. And then on top of that, we see that actually, despite putting the best technology we have available in place, we still have our processes that can be vulnerable. We have our users that are vulnerable. So we need to apply something we call continuous monitoring in order to constantly see what's going on and protect our users. So Greg, can you explain for us a bit more about continuous monitoring, please?
Gladly, yeah. Thank you, Ben. Great. Great overview, Ben. Really, really thank you for that. So what's important here, as Ben has mentioned, is that we don't just look at the login, and we don't just look necessarily at the transaction, but actually we think about a user journey and how they interact with the bank. So what you see here is, for example, the login, new beneficiary, change alerting, change contact details, create a transaction. Well, on the right-hand side, you'll see attempt authentication outcome. So what that means is that for each of these events, so be that a login, there is actually the attempt whereby, let's say, they provide their username, and then they receive let's say, a push notification. So then they will go through an authentication, and then there is an outcome. And what will actually happen here is, in a continuous monitoring approach, you will receive all of those events and all of the information that's inside of those events, the payload. So for example, the user agent, the cookies from where they were referred. Or it could be specific to the event that they're actually doing. So what is the event type? Or it could be the transaction type or the amount. And what's important is that if you have a somewhat decoupled approach in terms of the way you authenticate, so if you have an initiating device that is from the web and an authenticating device that is a mobile, well, that you receive both and that you reconcile those. So the process of continuous monitoring is ultimately to try and recreate the user journey and the user session inside of your fraud monitoring solution. And the reason for that is actually many fraud solutions are just looking at the login and just looking at the transaction, and the attack can fully propagate in between that. A great example of that is inside of corporate banking, whereby a user, an administrative user, could have had an account takeover, and by which point this account will then create a new user, and that new user will then create a new beneficiary and potentially create another new user. That other new user might approve that beneficiary creation and execute a transaction to that new beneficiary, and then the original administrative account that had an account takeover for it may approve that transaction. So if you're just monitoring the login and the transaction, all you would see there is that a user has logged in and then they are approving a transaction. What you don't necessarily see there is that there was two new users created that created a new beneficiary and signed that as well. So when you look at this with a more holistic view as to what is happening, it gives you a better understanding. In addition to that, if you just look at the login and the transaction, what you're not seeing is movement inside of the session. So the speed of interaction. You can, of course, defend yourself from login from brute force attacks from bots by looking at the number of requests. But if they distribute that type of attack, i.e., if they change the device or change the IP from which that comes from, then it's a bit harder to identify. But if it stays the same, then you can identify, let's say, a bot in that scenario. However, what's also interesting is the speed of movement between the different pages and between the types of things that they're looking to do. So actually, if you look at the way a user interacts inside of that session, and also crucially the sequence, the order that they do that in, what is normal for them? Do they log in and check their balance? Do they log in and look at a last payment? Do they log in and create a new beneficiary? What does a user normally do inside of that session? Well, all of these things create a behavioral profile for a user. So the concept of continuous monitoring is looking at the different events that a user will do inside of that user journey, and also the different sub-events that they will do, which is the attempt, the request, the authentication, and the outcome. And just because a one-time code and a one-time password is correct does not mean you should allow the user to continue. If I take that scenario from earlier where the initiating device is a web device and the authenticating device is a mobile device, if you see a completely different location for those and potentially malware on that mobile device, well, you might, even though there's a genuine one-time code generated, you might want to stop that user and stop or maybe even step up or change that user journey or that user experience. And what I've just explained there is that what you can ultimately do through this is build a digital profile for the user. So what you can do is you can extract information from the device itself, such as the device ID, the location, the IP address, the full user agent, any cookies on a web device. In a mobile, there's many other things you can take as well, whether there's a keyboard overlay, whether there's a debugger running, whether it's been jailbroken, these kinds of things as well, and build up a profile around the devices. And also you can start to look at the behavior in terms of the number of requests that you see, so the velocity or the amount of transactions that you're seeing. And you can build up a behavioral profile for their locations and the time and dates and time of month that they interact. So what you're starting to do now is build a behavioral context and history for your users to build trust. What you should not do is say, well, if it's new, we don't trust it. More, you should say, well, what do we normally see for this user, and how often do we see new devices, and is that known by anybody else, and is that likely a new device simply because, let's say, the browser was updated or they've changed something from that user agent string. So what you want is an algorithm that can handle that from your device ID as well. And when you apply a continuous monitoring, what you also are able to do is apply a continuous session monitoring, whereby every single event that occurs inside of a session will get a risk score or an anomaly detection score. And that can be from 0 to 100. And in this example here, what we can see is that is gradually increasing as this session continues. More specifically, at the start, they introduce a new device that is of a new age to the bank, and there was a failed password. But later on, we see actually the speed of navigation and the change of ISP and being referred from a suspicious website is also an issue. So with this real-time scoring, what you're then able to do is provide an actionable intelligence back out to the web application or the mobile application that is interacting with it. And this is where it's important to start to bring in things like machine learning. Because machine learning is a high dimensional space, it is beyond the realms, our capability of humans to think in the amount of dimensions that there are. And by dimensions, I mean specific points inside of a payload. So the device ID, the cookies, the referrer, URL, and so on. Right? So each of these we can take as a dimension. And as you increase those dimensions, those number of intelligence points or features that are used inside of a machine learning model, then it becomes impossible for a human to understand that, and crucially to build rules with that logic. So you need to move to machine learning, and you need to move to powerful algorithms that can behaviorally profile and model this type of attacks. They are able to learn complex fraud attacks and can ingest large volumes of data. Of course, they receive all data, they learn from all types of data, and as such, if you apply an anomaly detection or unsupervised learning, they can predict new types of attacks. You might not necessarily know what the attack is, but it can be unusual based on what you have seen in the past and what your users typically do. And it can learn from all of those attacks. Crucially, what you can do is you can label each of your alerts or the events that score high inside of your machine learning to provide feedback to then shift across to supervised or semi-supervised learning, which is going to be more powerful for you. And of course, it can reduce bias. We as fraud consultants, we try our hardest to take a data-centric or a data-first approach, but unfortunately, as humans, we are prone to bias in terms of availability or affirmation. Whereas machine learning, if you get it right, you can reduce that bias as well. And it can adapt to a changing distribution of a fraud or a drift. That crucially is a problem, I believe. Any models that were generated during this pandemic, well, post-pandemic world, I believe there'll be quite some challenges there for people. And we saw that pre-pandemic into a pandemic, there was a high amount of false alerts being generated simply due to the drift in behaviors of users in the way that they interact. And crucially, it can create a behavioral understanding as well. So Ben, if you'd like to take us through machine learning in fraud detection as well. Hi, Ben, I don't hear you. I think you might be muted.
Yes, okay, should be good now.
Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. So yeah, when it comes to machine learning in fraud detection, there's often a bit of misconceptions around two different types of machine learning that are out there. So between unsupervised and supervised learning, there's quite a big difference in what they're actually going to provide for you. So starting off with unsupervised machine learning, which is essentially typically used as a kind of model that will cluster data. So it will find clusters in your data, and then it will tell you, for example, this event, this falls in the normal cluster, so it looks to be normal. But this event falls far outside of my usual clusters of data, so there's something unusual about it. So the thing is, it's not going to tell you, what is that? It's going to tell you it's outside of your usual set of data. So it'll tell you there's something strange about it, but you won't actually know, is this actually fraudulent or not? While if you apply supervised machine learning, well, you've designed a model and you've taught that model to classify the different events or the data that you have. So that model has learned to essentially apply a risk score. While the previous unsupervised machine learning will not give you what they call a risk score, it'll actually give you what is called an anomaly score, which will tell you, how far does it fall out. So of course, supervised machine learning, because it's going to be tailored specifically to your different cases, it's going to give you more accurate predictions, and it's going to give you less false positives. So typically, supervised machine learning is going to be the preferred method, but it's a bit harder to get to because, to have a supervised machine learning model, well, you first need to have a lot of data that's actually labeled so you can then teach or train the model, what are those different classes and how to recognize them. So for a bank getting into machine learning, this is typically not going to be available, right off the bat, and they might start out with unsupervised learning, to help them find strange things in the data, and then as they evolve, as they mature, they will be labeling their data. They will be, indicating what is fraud, so that then later on they can train the model and they can teach the model to identify different types of fraud. Another thing that's quite important to keep in mind when you're applying machine learning to fraud detection is, in fraud detection, typically you have a very unbalanced data set, which means you have a very, very high amount of events that are normal or genuine, and the actual fraudulent events are a very, very small fraction of your total data set, typically less than 1%. Luckily, your local data scientists will be able to deal with this issue. So there are different, data science approaches in dealing with that. But it's something that, if you forget about it, it can be to a model essentially marking everything as genuine, because you have so few fraud cases. When you actually taught the model through your full data set, it has actually learned that it's gonna, if it tells you it's genuine, it has a an accuracy of 99.9%. So that's great, but it's actually not doing anything for you. It just says everything is genuine. So of course you need to deal with that as well. So just to paint you a picture as to why this is so important, and hopefully this will give you a better idea. We're going to take 3 different actions or events to look at, and we're going to see what's strange about them or not. So this is going to be our baseline event, right? User does a bill payment. They're doing it at 9 p.m., which if we look in the history for that user seems to be a normal time for them to do their banking actions. They're connecting, in this case, from North America, which is, again, their usual location to connect from. They're using Safari as a browser, which they've done in the past as well. It's the same device. So everything seems quite okay. And the bill payment, the biller is a known account, so they've used that several times in the past. So when we look at this as an analyst, we're going to say this is probably genuine, right? There's nothing really strange about this. Then if we have this one, well, we see that user is doing an international payment, which is not something they usually do. They're doing it at 3 a.m. their time, which is again quite strange for them to do. And they connected from somewhere in North Africa this time. They used a totally different browser. They used Google Chrome, and they used a Windows machine instead of a Mac. Also, the beneficiary they've used is something that we've never seen before for that user, but maybe we've never even seen used before in the bank as a whole. So it's not something that's very commonly used. Well, this one would typically say, this is probably phishing. Of course, it's not a guarantee, but it certainly looks like it's phishing. It has all the indicators of a phishing attack. Now, if we go to a more advanced attack and we present you with this one, well, we see there's a domestic payment. The time is pretty usual. The connection is, from the same location. The device is the same. The browser is the same. The only thing we see is that they've never really used this beneficiary before. Now here it's really hard based on just that little bit of data to say, yeah, this is fraudulent or this is genuine. Actually, we have no idea. We need to look at so much more than what we have here. We need to look at what happened before the payment in the session. What else have they done? What do they usually do? Was there anything strange about the session? Were they going abnormally fast, or have they used a very strange way of going through the session? And that's where, for example, machine learning can come in quite handy, but also just the approach that Greg was explaining about continuous monitoring is crucial, right? Like if I just give you this information, there's essentially no way to define whether this is malicious or not, or even suspicious. Like there's no idea. So that's why typically, we look at the 5 layers for online fraud detection as Gartner defines them, which is where you have the first layer, which is, you want to monitor the endpoint. So you want to collect device information. You want to understand those devices, how they relate to different users, how they change over time. You also typically want to apply protection to those devices if you can. For web, that's going to be difficult, but for mobile, because you're deploying an application on a user's device, you can protect that application. You can build in technology that protects the application from malware and from external attacks, which is going to be quite important to do. Then as a second layer, we have the behavioral layer. So we want to investigate, is there something strange going on in this session? Is there a high number of requests? Are they going abnormally fast or abnormally slow? Are they doing an unusually large amount of sessions today for some reason? We're going to find those different correlations and look at, is this a normal session or is this, potentially a strange session? We can also then look at the third layer, which is going to be account-centric. So we're going to look into the history of the user, and we're going to see what are some beneficiaries they usually use. What are the times they usually connect from, the locations they connect from, what are the operations they typically do, the devices they have, and so on. And just understanding, this user as an individual and their, digital profile. And then as a fourth layer, we want to bring in the different channels and we want to unify those, right? Like we don't want to look at web and mobile banking as two different silos. We want to bring those two together because they can enrich each other. If we see a user just accessed from one part of the world on the web banking and an hour later they're accessing mobile banking from the other side of the world, well, that should indicate that something's potentially going wrong there, and either one of those was not correct. So it's important not to silo those out completely. And then finally, we want to bring in big data. We want to bring machine learning, which can provide us actionable intelligence. Potentially, we can connect to external data feeds that give us, indicators of compromise that we can also use that are maybe already present in your perimeter defense systems. So you might already have useful information that you can then repurpose and apply to your customers as well. And then, of course, when we bring all of this together, we can actually have a better understanding of, what is happening in a session, and if something is potentially wrong in that session, and if we need to take an immediate response. So we can do all of this in real time, of course, which means that at any point during the customer's journey, we can, as a bank, intervene. We can say, oh, this is, potentially suspicious. I'm going to put them to a different kind of journey. I'm going to apply an additional authentication. I'm going to put them into a read-only mode. I'm going to queue the payment for review because I want to review it manually. There's so many things you can think of that you can then do, right? As long as technologically you can do it, you can then put the user through that journey, which is really, really powerful. So, 4 things we want you to take away from the presentation today. Well, first one is actually, I saw that there's, last year, there was an 81% increase in malware activity in Turkey specifically. It's a trend we see globally, but it's good to be aware of that, malware activity and especially mobile malware is definitely on the rise. There's, plenty of people going towards these digital channels that weren't there before. So, the market is ready for the attackers to take advantage of. And you need to be prepared, from your end. Of course, there's going to be regulatory compliance, and in Turkey specifically, again, we saw that there's some regulation floating around that requires you to do some level of monitoring on your customers to, monitor those authentication processes specifically for different common types of attacks. And we see globally that regulators are essentially, cracking down and saying it's no longer acceptable that you as a bank are not identifying these, common and known attack scenarios, and that you're not trying to protect your users from them. So regulations are globally increasing. We see that in PSU 2, but we see that in other parts of the world as well, that it's just no longer acceptable to do this. And so, we're fighting these increasingly complex digital banking attacks. So we need to have tools that allow us to do that. If you are just monitoring a payment alone, you are not going to be able to define, what is fraud and what is not. That works for maybe anti-money laundering cases and things like that. But if we look at, digital banking attacks, it's not sufficient. As I showed you, it's almost impossible to determine in some cases whether something is an attacker or a genuine payment. And then finally, having real-time responses is super crucial because it allows you to intervene immediately when something happens to your users. And it doesn't just, allow you to prevent the attack in most cases, but sometimes the attacks also will propagate. Attackers will throw more resources if their attack is successful, so they will expand. And the fraud will grow really, really fast once it's successful. So you need to be able to move equally fast as well. So that's super important. So I think with that, I want to thank everyone that's still here for attending our talk today. The organization Fintech for having us today as well. And I think we can move into a Q&A. Hopefully we have some interesting questions to answer for you.
Sure, yes, we can move into Q&A session. Ekin, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Is there any questions from the attendees? Who can stick with us so far?
I cannot see any yet, so Okay.
I may ask a question.
Good. It would be a good start, right?
Okay, you know that maybe the most important question is how the financial players can provide maximum security with the best user experience at the same time, because you know that there are jokes on it, especially 2FA and the other stuff, and all of the stuff for the maximum security is disturbing the user and user experience. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. So typically it's seen as a trade-off, as you say, right? So as you increase security, user experience decreases. Well, actually, what we believe you can do is it will decrease ever so slightly insofar as I guess the best user experience is simply just being able to interact, right, and not have to provide any form of authentication, be that a username or a password or anything else. So if you get past that initial barrier of a decrease in terms of UX, well, actually you can improve it. For example, a great experience is sending a push notification to a user and allowing them to utilize the fingerprint to continue. It's seamless, it's an additional channel, and it gives them context around what they're doing and helps them to understand, well, actually, this is something that secures me in my interaction. Also, if you apply a continuous monitoring and server-side analytics with behavioral profiling, well, what you're able to do is reduce some of those automatic business requirements around authentication. So let's say you apply strong customer authentication to all of your customers on login. Well, that's not necessarily required because actually, the vast majority of users are not having a problem. There is not an increased risk. So actually what you're able to do is lower the requirements for somebody to interact with you and then just apply it when there is a change in behavior, when there is an increased risk. So if you build your solution in such a way, then what you can ultimately do is improve user experience for the majority of your users and their interactions, and then just challenge them when there is that increased risk.
Thank you, Greg. And another question from me again.
Sure.
I have lots of questions. Okay, as OneSpan, I think you have lots of bank customers, but if we think of about the fintech startups or scale-ups, the other companies, how about how can they use OneSpan solutions? Is it reachable or not? Or what is your model to work with? This is why.
Sure. Ben, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, we provide different types of solutions. We provide both cloud approaches as well as on-premise approaches. So we can address the organization depending on how they've architected. We see in the banking industry there is a lot of on-prem, but there is also the move towards cloud. Cloud has many benefits, of course, for an organization, especially in terms of TCO and things like that, because of course analytics tends to be something that's a bit heavier in terms of processing and hardware requirements and so on. So of course, by adopting cloud, you can take that that cost away and instead have it on the cloud provider. But yeah, it's something that's you can also phase out these kinds of deployments, right? You can start small and then build up from there and expand, which is again typically a recommended approach because you don't want to go into a 2-year project and try to do everything at once, but you can start small, do quick wins, and have a more agile type of approach as well.
So I see we received a question. So from anonymous attendee. So what is alternative of OTP to prevent phishing risk? So indeed, a good question. So the one-time password, if that is generated without context for the user, then they are vulnerable to social engineering to obtain that, or potentially malware on the mobile device if it's an SMS one-time password that is sent. So indeed, they are therefore vulnerable to phishing. So there are many ways around that in terms of technologies. So what you could look to do is establish a secure channel with your users through a mobile banking application. That way, then, what it is not doing is using that same channel to interact with them, and also it is a secure way of communicating that only that user on that device can see. An example of that could be to display what's called a Cronto image, which is a secure color QR code on a screen, and then the user has to scan that, and then it will display on their mobile device exactly what it is that they are scanning and what they are approving. So they're brought into that journey to understand exactly what they are signing and how that one-time password is generated as well. So that's, I guess, two ways of identifying that. But phishing generally is the type of attack that banks should be able to identify because of the introduction of new attributes, specifically the device, the cookies, the user agent, the location, and crucially, an attacker, hopefully, or well, I don't expect, will be paying your bills. They will be paying themselves, so a new beneficiary as well.
Okay.
I think that this was Elena's question. Am I right, Greg?
No.
I don't see the person, sorry.
No.
No, that question was from the Q&A side.
Okay. There's another question.
Yep.
You mentioned that SMS OTP notification is not a good option and can be easily stolen by fraudsters. What do you suggest as a method or strategy for SCA process? This is from Elena Ramishville.
Yeah, I suppose the answer is pretty similar to the previous question.
Okay.
So in a nutshell, I mean, look into software types of options. You can build it into your mobile banking app. Typically, if they have SMS, they have a phone, and in the vast majority of cases, that phone is going to be a smartphone. So you can deploy your application. You can have a secure way of communicating and exchanging those, and you can address the the user experience part of it at the same time, because those SMS messages are, from a UX perspective, not very pleasant. It's much easier for me to get a notification on my phone, tap, yet this is me logging in, give a fingerprint, give a face ID, give a PIN code, whatever, and then be logged in automatically without having to type any numbers and so on. So that's typically the recommended approach right now in the industry.
Then it comes to biometrics. The other question is coming from the biometric. Can technologies such as behavioral biometrics help to achieve CX and enhance security balance?
I'll kick us off on that. Maybe Ben, you can add some stuff in as well. So behavioral biometrics are great. This is something we make use of as well, because what it's going to allow you to do is understand the interaction of a user on a device. Which is fantastic. So what you can then look to do is, if you have the power of that inside of your algorithms, identify if there is an interaction that you have seen before, which is actually an attacker, right? Or if that is an interaction that is your same user and continues to be your same user. So even though the risk increases, let's say their device changes, but if their interaction with that device is the same, then you have an increased trust or a guarantee around that. Also, in terms of the way that they will interact with their web session, their typing cadence, their speed, their interaction on pages, these kinds of things as well. So it's great. What's not so great around that is that actually, if there is a full a synthetic identity or an account takeover, an identity theft from the outset, well, actually that behavioral profiling is learning that of the attacker from the outset. So it doesn't therefore have something to contrast it against necessarily at that point. But yeah, it's great for that. It's also great for identifying a human versus a bot interaction as well, and contrasting that in terms of the speed and interaction on the pages. Though I believe as we move towards open banking and more automation around, specifically from the TPPs and so forth, the types of interactions and calls that we see, there will be many more automated interactions. So it might be quite difficult to contrast those.
Yeah, I think to add to that, another thing behavioral biometrics can be super useful for is actually They can be used to try and identify if an individual is the authentic user, but is under a stressful situation, which is typically the case if we're dealing with coaching type of social engineering attacks, where it's actually the genuine user that's interacting with the bank, but there's someone that's guiding them through and essentially social engineering into doing something that they don't want to do. So there's a lot of these types of scam attacks where they're then convinced they have to do a payment to what's supposedly the police or the government or something like that. And so this individual will be in a different situation than they are usually. And some of the behavioral biometrics can actually identify this and pick this up when it's a coaching situation, which is again super useful because it's one of the harder attacks to identify because of so many things will be regular. There will be a regular connection, regular device, and so on.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very informative session. Actually, I didn't know about especially the numbers. I was very attracted to numbers and the 37 billion records compromised so far. It's huge actually. And the ratio mentioned you mentioned before that the 10% of the population will be compromised in 2020. That's promising.
That's an estimate by me though. Just to caveat that. It's not official numbers.
Okay, but it's a promising number actually. And I was very surprised actually. Thank you for both of your presentations. Actually, it was very informative, and maybe in conclusion, the machine learning, we can say that the machine learning is the best way to do to maximize the user experience, to better the user experience. Maybe we can say that because the user that doesn't want anything else in his or her life anymore, actually, especially the bicycles, the motorcycles, and the other stuff in their lives. And it is the most important thing because we are exponentially going to forward to the digital life, and we're going to expose more, as you said. So that, thank you guys for the presentations, and we will share all the information in this webinar with all of the people who registered tomorrow actually, and with your presentations as well. And you may all of the attendees can find the recording of this webinar on FinTR's YouTube channel. And I think it can. Am I right? Is we will write a short description of this decryption of this webinar as an article.
Yes, exactly. We will on Medium.
Okay.
Please follow us on Medium.
And also you can get in contact with the speakers through this emailing as well. Any other last words from you, Greg and Ben?
Just a big thank you. It's been a pleasure, and it's been lovely speaking to you, and we really appreciate the invitation. Thank you, and thank you to the audience for their keen interest and great questions as well.
Thank you.
Same for me. Thanks to both the audience and the organization.
And to FinTR.
And maybe to add to that, you can also check our blogs on blog of OneSpan. So I think it's blog.onespan.com. We every now and then publish some articles which might be interesting to you as well.
Thanks, Ben, and have a good day then, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.